The deadbolt clicked shut before Walter Brennan reached the bottom step, 74 years old. One cardboard box pressed against his chest, a November wind cutting through a coat that had been good enough for 40 winters on this land. He turned around once. The porch light was off. The curtains did not move. His son was somewhere inside the house, and his son was not coming out. This was the house Walter raised. Not bought raised, board by board, the summer he turned 22. The fields beyond it were the fields he'd worked before Derek was born, before Derek could walk, before Derek learned the word that finished him. Sign here, Dad. It's just paperwork. I'll handle the rest. He handled it. The farm, the accounts, the name on every deed. And here was Walter's share of 40 years of trust a box, a worn-out coat, and $11 folded behind a book of stamps he'd never finished using. The truck took 3 tries to start. He let it idle in the cold and watched the only home he'd ever known shrink in the mirror. What Derek didn't know, what Derek had never once thought to ask about, was something his mother had quietly built and never let him see. In 3 days, a woman behind a bank counter would say 6 words, and the locked door would stop mattering at all. 3 weeks earlier, Walter Brennan still woke at 4:40 in the morning, because that was the hour the body remembers even after the cows are gone. He'd sold the last of the herd in 2019, but the habit stayed. He would rise in the dark, put the percolator on the stove, never the new machine Derek bought him, the old steel percolator, and stand at the kitchen window with a chipped mug, while the sky over Cedar Hollow turned from black to gray to the pale gold that meant another day on the farm. 40 acres. A barn he'd re-roofed twice. A farmhouse with a porch swing that still held the dent where Eleanor used to sit. Eleanor had been gone 4 years now. Walter talked to her anyway. He'd tell her the weather, tell her what the Hendersons down the road were up to, tell her the porch needed paint, and that he'd get to it come spring. Some mornings he set out 2 mugs without thinking, and then quietly put one back. The thing about Walter that nobody in town quite knew what to do with was his hands. He could fix anything. A neighbor's seized water pump, a busted irrigation line, the school's ancient boiler the winter the furnace company quoted $9,000, Walter had it running in an afternoon for the price of a gasket. As a young man, he'd been the kind of farmhand who couldn't look at a broken machine without taking it apart in his head, figuring out the smarter way the part should have been built in the first place. He never made much of it. A man fixes what's in front of him, he'd say, and leave it there. Derek moved back in that autumn. 46 years old, a second marriage gone bad. A business in Dayton that had folded for reasons Walter never got a straight answer about. Walter didn't ask many questions. The boy was his boy. He made up the spare room, cleared a space in the barn for Derek's truck, and was genuinely glad to have the noise of another person in the house again. At first it was good. Derek cooked a few dinners. He drove his father to the VA appointment in the city. He talked about the farm like he cared about it, asked about the back 40, asked whose name the property was under, asked more than once about money. Walter answered every question. He had nothing to hide and no reason to think anyone wanted to hurt him. Then the papers started. Derek would bring them to the kitchen table after supper, a pen already uncapped. Power of attorney, he said, in case anything happened. Easier for the taxes, he said. Just protecting you, Dad. The bank prefers it this way. Walter signed. His reading glasses lived in his shirt pocket, but he didn't always reach for them. Because why would a man read the fine print on something his own son slid across the table? One night, lifting the stack, to sign the last page, Walter noticed the percolator had gone cold on the stove behind him. He couldn't remember turning the burner off. He stood there a moment, holding the pen, a small cold feeling moving through his chest like a draft from a door left open somewhere in the house. Then Derek said, "You good, Dad?" and smiled, and Walter signed and told himself it was nothing. It was not nothing. But that was the kind of man Walter Brennan was. He fixed what was in front of him, and he trusted the people he loved. And he did not yet know that those two things were about to cost him everything he had left. It happened on a Tuesday in November. The 11th, to be exact. Walter would remember the date for the rest of his life because it was on the kitchen calendar in his own handwriting, circled with two words beside it, Derek Bank. He'd thought they were going together. Instead, Walter came in from the barn that morning to find a man he didn't know sitting at his kitchen table. Mid-30s, pressed shirt, a leather folder open in front of him. Derek stood by the counter with his arms crossed. The stranger introduced himself as a real estate closing agent and slid a single sheet of paper across the table, and the word at the top of it was sold. The farm. 40 acres, the barn, the farmhouse, the porch swing with the dent in it. Sold, the agent explained gently, as if gentleness changed anything to a development group out of Columbus. The closing had already happened. The signatures Derek had the power of attorney, after all, were already in place. The new owners would take possession in 30 days. The agent was only here to deliver the courtesy notice and review the timeline. Walter looked at his son. "Derek, what is this? It's done, Dad." Derek wouldn't meet his eyes. "It's the smart move. You can't keep this place up anymore." "We talked about this, They had not talked about this. Walter did the only thing a man like Walter knew how to do. He fought. Not with his fists, with his feet and his telephone and 40 years of his own stubbornness. He drove into town the next morning and sat for 2 hours in the waiting room of the only lawyer in Cedar Hollow, a tired man named Pruitt, who finally took the documents, read them twice, and set them down with the careful flatness of someone who already knows the answer is no. The power of attorney was valid. Walter had signed it. He had signed all of it, the POA, the listing authorization, the disclosure waivers over 6 weeks of suppers, 1 page at a time, his glasses in his pocket. Pruitt said the word contest and then said the words expensive and years and I'm sorry, Walter, in roughly that order. To unwind a sale this far along would take money Walter no longer had, and time a man of 74 could not count on. Walter called the bank. He called the county recorder. He called the development group's office in Columbus and was put on hold and then disconnected. Every door he pushed on was already locked. He came home each evening more determined and got nowhere. And that was the cruelty of it. He was active, he was fighting, he was doing everything a younger man would do, and none of it moved an inch. The 30 days collapsed into one on the last morning. Walter packed. Not much fit in one box, so he chose carefully Eleanor's photograph from the mantel, his reading glasses, a folder of papers he didn't fully understand, a flannel shirt she'd patched at the elbow. He left the farm equipment. He left the tools he'd collected over half a century. He left the porch swing. When he came down the stairs with the box, the closing agent was gone and a locksmith's van was in the driveway. Derek was standing on the porch, and there was already a new lock on the front door, the brass of it still bright. Walter stopped on the bottom step. "You changed the locks. New owner's insurance," Derek said. "It's standard. The new owners didn't take possession for another 6 hours." Walter understood, standing in the cold, exactly what the locks were really for. They were not for the strangers from Columbus. They were for him. He set the box in the bed of his truck. The truck took 3 tries to start, and Walter Brennan drove off his own land for the last time, alone, with $11 in his wallet and a place to sleep that did not yet exist. The county shelter was full. Walter spent the first night in the truck behind the grain elevator, the second in a church parking lot, and on the third night, out of options and out of gas money, he pulled into the lot behind First Cedar Savings because it was flat and quiet and the street light there was burned out. He reclined the seat. He put Eleanor's flannel over his shoulders. He told her goodnight the way he always did. And before he slept, for no reason he could name, he opened the folder of papers he'd grabbed off the mantel, the one he'd never understood. Bank statements, mostly decades old, addressed to a post office box in Eleanor's name he had forgotten she'd ever kept. He'd assumed they were nothing. Eleanor's careful little nothings. He almost put the folder away. Then his eye caught a number at the bottom of the last page. Walter reached for his glasses with a hand that had suddenly gone unsteady and held the paper up to the dim cab light and read the number again. And his breath stopped in his chest. The number on the page was $2,341,000 and some odd cents, and Walter Brennan read it 11 times before he let himself believe the decimal point was where he thought it was. It made no sense. The statement was 3 years old, dated the month before Eleanor died. The account was at First Cedar Savings, the very bank whose parking lot he was sitting in, but it was an account Walter had never opened, never deposited into, never once seen a dollar from. The name on it was his own. Walter J. Brennan. Trust the mailing address was the post office box. He sat there in the cold cab with the paper trembling in his hand, and the only thing he could think, absurdly, was that it had to be a mistake, because men like Walter did not have $2 million and not know it. He did not sleep. At 4:40 in the morning, the hour his body still kept, he was sitting upright behind the wheel, watching the bank's back door, waiting for someone to come unlock it so he could find out what kind of mistake this was. He was still waiting 2 hours later when a knuckle rapped on his window. She was younger than he expected for a manager. Dark hair pulled back, a travel mug in one hand, a lanyard around her neck that read Vega M, branch manager. She'd seen the old truck in the lot, seen the man sleeping in it, and instead of calling the police, she'd knocked. Walter rolled the window down halfway, embarrassed, ready to apologize and move along. Maria Vega looked at his face, and then at the folder open on his passenger seat, and her eyes caught the letterhead. "Dot, that's our statement," she said. "Where did you get that?" "It was my wife's," Walter said. "I think there's been some mistake. The number's wrong." "What's your name, sir?" "Brennan." "Walter Brennan." She went very still. Walter watched something move across her face, recognition, and then something more careful underneath it. She said, quietly, "Mr. Brennan, I think you should come inside. I think you've been looking for me, and you didn't even know it." She unlocked the front door before the rest of the staff arrived, sat him in the chair across from her desk, and brought him a cup of coffee in a real mug. Then she pulled his file up on her screen, and Walter watched her read it and watched her go quiet again. "This account was flagged for closure 6 months ago," she said. "Dormant, no activity since the last deposit. Corporate wanted it, esceted, turned over to the state as unclaimed property. There's a final statement we're required to mail before we close it. It's been sitting in my drawer since I started here. I kept not sending it." She looked up at him. "I don't know why. It didn't feel right." She slid the unopened envelope across the desk. Mr. Brennan, she said, your wife left instructions. It took the rest of that day and most of the next to understand what Eleanor had done. Maria Vega did not have to help him. A man living out of a truck, a dormant account flagged by corporate, a paper trail 30 years old, the easy thing, the thing most managers would do, was hand him a 1-800 number and a claims form and wish him luck. But Maria had a reason, and she told it to him plainly on the second afternoon, because she was the kind of person who thought a man deserved to know why a stranger was on his side. Her own grandfather, she said, had died in a county home in Texas with $40,000 sitting in an account no one in the family knew existed. Money that would have changed his last years. Money the bank closed and sent to the state because no one walked in to claim it in time. She'd gone into banking partly because of it. I became a manager so I could be the one who keeps the drawer, she said. So somebody walks in, and somebody's still here who cares whether they do. So Maria Vega kept the drawer. She walked Walter through the paperwork, line by line, the thing his son had counted on him never doing. And the story that came out of those pages rearranged everything Walter thought he knew about the quiet woman he'd been married to for 41 years. In 1986, when Derek was a boy and the farm was barely breaking even, Walter had fixed a thing. A neighbor's irrigation system kept blowing its valves under pressure, and Walter, being Walter, had taken one apart at the kitchen table and figured out the smarter way the seat in the diaphragm should have been seated to take the surge without failing. He machined a few in the barn. They worked. Neighbors wanted them. Walter, who never made much of anything he did with his hands, made a few dozen and forgot about it. Eleanor did not forget about it. Eleanor had taken one of those valves and a hand-drawn diagram in Walter's own pencil to a patent attorney 2 counties over without telling him, because she knew her husband, and she knew that if she asked him, he would wave it off as nothing. She filed the patent in Walter's name in 1986. She licensed it quietly, through the mail, from a post office box she rented so the paperwork wouldn't clutter the kitchen, to an agricultural supply company that put Walter's valve into tens of thousands of irrigation units across the Midwest over the next 3 decades. And every royalty check, every quarter, for 31 years, Eleanor had deposited into a trust account at First Cedar Savings. She never spent $1 of it. She never told a soul. Walter found, tucked in the folder, a note in her handwriting on a single index card for Walter. When he's done taking care of everyone else, he'll never build himself a nest. So I built him one. Walter put his glasses on the desk and put his face in his hands, and Maria Vega quietly left the office and closed the door so the old man could be alone with his wife for a while. The money was not his yet. That was the next hard thing. A dormant trust of that size could not simply be handed over a counter. There were identity verifications, a death certificate for Eleanor, the original trust instrument, ears notices for 31 years of royalty income that needed to be reconciled, and because of the dollar amount and the dormancy flag, a full legal review by the bank's compliance department before a single cent moved. Maria estimated 4 to 6 weeks. Walter had no address, no current bank account, and was sleeping in a truck behind the building. So he went to work, the only way he knew how. He got a room a weekly rate at the Cedar Motor Lodge, paid out of the last of his cash, and a small advance Maria helped him arrange against the verified account. He spent his mornings at Pruitt, the lawyer's office, this time as a client with leverage, gathering the documents the bank needed. He spent his afternoons fixing things, the motel's ice machine, the lawyer's sticking back door. A widow named Coletta, 2 rooms down, whose oxygen concentrator was rattling Walter, had it quiet in 20 minutes and wouldn't take her money. A man fixes what's in front of him. Word got around Cedar Hollow, the way word does in a town that small. But it got around wrong. The story everyone heard was Derek's version, planted early and often, that old Walter had lost his mind, that he'd been a burden, that the sale of the farm was a mercy, that the poor man was now telling people at the motel he was secretly a millionaire. At the diner on Main, Walter heard 2 men he'd known 30 years lower their voices when he walked in. The pharmacist asked, too kindly, whether Walter was getting any help these days. A teenager at the gas station called him the truck millionaire and laughed, and the laugh followed Walter out into the parking lot. He let them laugh. He fixed Coletta's storm window and filed his papers and waited for the bank, and he did not say one word in his own defense. Because Walter Brennan had learned a long time ago that you do not argue with a closed door. You wait for the right key. Derek found out. He found out the way Walter knew he eventually would: somebody at the bank, somebody at the diner, somebody, and Derek did not call his father. Derek called a lawyer. The letter arrived at the Cedar Motor Lodge on a Thursday on the stationery of a firm in Dayton. It was addressed to Walter, and it was, in its way, a masterpiece of cruelty dressed up in cold paragraphs. It asserted that Walter Brennan was a person of diminished capacity. It announced Derek's intention to file for guardianship to have the court declare his own father legally incompetent to manage his affairs. And it named, specifically, by account number, the First Cedar Savings Trust. Derek didn't just want the farm anymore. Derek wanted control of Walter himself so that the $2 million would flow through a guardian's hands. Through Derek's hands. It was a brilliant attack, and Walter understood the brilliance of it cold. If a court ruled him incompetent, it would not matter whose name was on the patent or the trust. A son could not be locked out of money his father was no longer permitted to touch. Walter read the letter twice, set it on the motel desk, and for the first time since the night behind the grain elevator, the cold draft moved through his chest again. Maria's verification was weeks away. The guardianship petition could be filed in days. Walter brought the letter to Maria Vega the next morning, and to Pruitt the lawyer that same afternoon, and the two of them together did the thing Derek had never imagined his father capable of organizing. They fought back with paper, on paper's terms. Pruitt filed a request for an independent capacity evaluation. Walter would be examined by a court-appointed geriatric physician, not a hired one. And Pruitt would make sure of it. Maria did something else. Because the trust was now under full compliance review for a guardianship claim, the bank's legal department was obligated to authenticate every original document in the file, including the one document the trust had preserved for 31 years and that existed nowhere else. The 1986 notarized signature card. When Eleanor opened the trust, the bank had required a notarized specimen of Walter's signature, his true, deliberate, witnessed signature, sealed and dated and filed away in 1986, and never touched since. It had sat in the vault for 3 decades, doing nothing. Maria pulled it for the review. And when she laid it beside the recent loan documents that compliance had flagged on the farm property, the documents that had come in with Walter's name on them, she stopped. She called Pruitt. Pruitt called a forensic document examiner. And the examiner confirmed, in a written report with the signatures enlarged side by side, what the bank's own records had quietly been pointing at all along. The signature on the 1986 card was Walter's. The signature on a $400,000 home equity loan taken against the farm 8 months earlier, a loan Walter had never heard of, against a property he thought was unencumbered. It was a forgery. A good one. but not good enough to stand beside the real thing under glass. Derek had not simply convinced his father to sell the farm. Derek had already mortgaged it out from under him for $400,000, forging the old man's name, and gambled the money away in Dayton, and the rush sale to the Columbus developers had been a desperate move to bury the fraud under a clean closing before anyone thought to compare a signature. The guardianship petition had been the same instinct, scaled up. Get control of the father. And no one ever audits the books. But the very document Eleanor had filed to protect her husband's money, a signature card neither Walter nor Derek had thought about in 31 years, was now the one piece of paper in the county that could prove exactly what Derek had done. The court-appointed physician examined Walter on a Monday and wrote 3 sentences that ended the guardianship before it began. The patient was oriented, lucid, and entirely competent to manage his own affairs, and the petition appeared to be without medical basis. That alone would have stopped Derek. The forensic report did more than stop him. Pruitt walked the examiner's report and the document examiner's findings into the county prosecutor's office on a Wednesday afternoon. And by Friday, the same Dayton lawyer who had written the cold paragraphs about diminished capacity was no longer returning Derek's calls, because a lawyer defending a man against criminal forgery charges costs a great deal more and asks a great many harder questions than a lawyer filing a guardianship. The plan hadn't just failed. It had turned in Derek's hand and cut him. Maria Vega closed Walter's file on the dormancy review that same week, not to escort it to the state, but to release it. The trust was authenticated. The instrument was clean. The death certificate was filed, the income reconciled, the verifications complete. She printed 1 page, slid it across the desk to the old man who 6 weeks earlier had been sleeping in the parking lot outside her window, and said, "Miss Brennan, it's yours, all of it. What do you want to do with it?" Walter Brennan looked at the number he could now read without his hands shaking. Then he looked out the window, toward the road that ran north out of town, past the diner, past the gas station, toward 40 acres and a farmhouse with a porch swing that had a dent in it. First thing, he said, "I want to buy back my wife's house." The Columbus developers had not broken ground yet. That was the first piece of luck, and Walter pressed it like a man who'd learned exactly how little luck a person gets. There was a complication, and it cut in Walter's favor. The development group's title insurance review, triggered by the criminal referral against Derek, had found the forged $400. 000 lien, sitting on the property like a crack in a foundation. A title with a known forgery on it could not be cleanly conveyed. Their lawyers, facing the prospect of building 40 townhouses on land whose chain of ownership was now evidence in a fraud case, did the thing developers do when a deal turns radioactive. They looked for the exit. Walter handed it to them. Through Pruitt, he offered to buy the farm back at the price they'd paid, plus their carrying costs, in exchange for a clean release and a signed statement of the sales circumstances for the prosecutor's file. Cash, no financing, no contingencies, no 30-day wait. Maria Vega arranged the funds transfer from the trust in a single afternoon. On a gray morning in early December, Walter Brennan signed his name, his real name, slow and deliberate, his reading glasses on his nose, to a deed that put 40 acres, a barn, and a farmhouse with a porch swing back in his hands. The closing agent who slid the paper across the table this time was not a stranger in his kitchen. It was Pruitt in his own cluttered office, and when it was done, the old lawyer shook Walter's hand and held it a beat longer than a handshake needs. Walter drove out to the farm that afternoon and walked the rooms. Derek had left them mostly bare. The porch swing still hung where it always had. Walter sat in it in the cold and told Eleanor he was home, and told her what her note had set in motion, and sat there a long while. The story moved through Cedar Hollow a second time, and this time it moved with the weight of the prosecutor's office behind it, and this time it was true. The men at the diner who had lowered their voices now stopped Walter to shake his hand. The pharmacist who'd asked if he was getting help reddened and said he was glad things had worked out. Coletta from the motel told everyone who'd listened about the man who fixed her oxygen machine for free when he had $11 to his name, and that detail, the $11, did more for Walter's standing in that town than the $2 million ever could. People can forgive a man for being rich. What they remember is a man who was kind when he was broke. The teenager from the gas station did not call him the truck millionaire anymore. Nobody did, but Walter did not move back into the farmhouse. That surprised people. He kept his weekly room at the Cedar Motor Lodge and spent his days driving, walking the property, sitting with Eleanor's index card in his shirt pocket, and turning a question over the way he used to turn a broken valve over in his hands. For Walter, when he's done taking care of everyone else, he'd read it 100 times. He kept catching on the same word. Everyone. Eleanor hadn't built him a nest so he could sit in it alone. Walter had known her 41 years. He knew exactly what she would have done with $2 million and an empty farmhouse and a life that had run mostly to its end. So he started making calls. He drove to the county courthouse and asked questions about the foster system. He learned the thing that breaks the heart of every small county in the country, that when a foster child turns 18, the support stops, the placement ends. And a kid who has never had a stable home gets handed a trash bag of belongings and a date on the calendar. Cedar Hollow had 7 of them aging out that year. 3 were already couch surfing. 1 was sleeping in a car behind the grain elevator, the same lot where Walter had spent his first night with $11 and nowhere to go. That was the one that decided it. A boy named Tyrell, 17, in a truck in the cold, in the exact place Walter had been. Walter brought the idea to Maria Vega across the same desk where she'd slid him the unopened envelope. He wanted to turn the farmhouse into transitional housing, real beds, real rooms, a place where a kid aging out could land and learn to stand. He wanted to convert the old Grange Hall on the edge of town, which had sat empty for a decade, into a community center with a kitchen so that no kid in Cedar Hollow ate alone. He wanted his hands to teach what his hands knew: engines, plumbing, wiring, the smarter way of things should have been built to kids who'd never had a man show them anything. Maria listened to all of it. Then she said she'd handle the trust, the nonprofit filings, the accounts, all of it at no fee on her own time. My grandfather's 40,000 built nothing, she said. Let's see what your wife's 2 million can do. But Derek was not finished. And Walter did not let himself pretend he was the criminal case, ground forward slowly, as criminal cases do. Derek had hired a defense lawyer with the last of whatever he had, and the lawyer was floating exactly the defense Walter had feared from the start, that the loan signature was authorized, that Walter's memory was unreliable, that an old man trying to give away $2 million to strangers was hardly a man whose competence should be taken at face value. The guardianship was dead, but its ghost still walked. If Derek could muddy the question of Walter's mind, he could muddy the question of the forgery. And a muddy forgery case is one a jury might not convict on. And there was a court date set, a hearing where Derek would appear, where the document examiner would testify. where Walter himself would have to sit in a room with the son who locked the door, and where the truth of the signatures, the real one and the false one, would finally be laid side by side under glass in front of a judge. Walter marked the date on a new kitchen calendar, in his own handwriting, the way he marked everything. He was not afraid of the room anymore. He had spent his whole life waiting for the right key, and he finally held it. The hearing was on a Thursday morning in January in the small wood-paneled courtroom on the second floor of the Cedar Hollow Courthouse, and Walter Brennan wore the flannel shirt Eleanor had patched at the elbow. Derek was already there when Walter came in. He had aged in 2 months thinner, grayer, the confidence gone out of his shoulders. He did not turn around. Walter sat in the second row, took out his reading glasses, set them in his shirt pocket, and waited the way he had learned to wait. Derek's lawyer went first, and he went exactly where Walter knew he would. He spoke about a confused elderly man. He spoke about memory, about a son trying to manage an impossible situation, about a father now giving his fortune away to strangers. Is that the judgment of a sound mind? He asked the court to consider whether Walter Brennan truly understood his own affairs. It was the guardianship argument again, in a darker suit. It was the same locked door. Then Pruitt stood up, and he did not argue. He simply asked the court to admit 2 documents into evidence, and to display them side by side. The clerk placed them on the easel, where the judge and the gallery could both see. On the left, the home equity loan, 8 months old, $400,000. Walter J. Brennan signed at the bottom. On the right, a yellowed card from 1986, notarized, sealed, the same name in the same place. The document examiner took the stand and spoke for 11 minutes in the flat, unhurried voice of a person who deals only in what can be measured. The pen pressure, the letter formation, the angle of the W, the loop of the B, the way a real signature varies within a consistent range, and a forged one betrays itself in the hesitation marks where a hand slowed down to copy. He enlarged the 2 signatures on the courtroom screen until they filled the wall. Anyone in the room could see it. You did not need to be an expert. The 1986 signature flowed. The loan signature crawled. In my professional opinion, the examiner said, the signature on the loan document was not made by the same hand that made the signature on the trust card. It is a tracing executed slowly by a second party. The courtroom was very quiet. And then the question that ended it. Pruitt turned, almost gently, to the simple fact the whole defense had been built to avoid. A man with diminished capacity cannot forge a careful signature, and he also cannot detect one. But Walter had detected it. Walter had brought the original card. Walter had assembled the documents, retained the examiner, passed an independent court-ordered competency evaluation, recovered the property, and organized a charitable trust, all of it lucid, all of it on the record. The confused elderly man had built the entire case, now collapsing on his son. Derek's lawyer had no cross-examination. There was nothing left to cross. Derek finally turned around in his seat and looked at his father, and for the first time in 2 months, Walter looked back at him. There was no triumph in Walter's face. There was no fight in it either. There was only a long, level look between a father and a son, and the silence held everything that had been done and could not be undone. The judge bound the matter over for the criminal proceeding and ruled plainly that Walter Brennan was fully competent to manage his own affairs, and that the question of his capacity was not to be raised again. Outside, in the cold marble hallway, Derek caught up to him. His voice cracked on the first word. Dad, please, they're talking about prison. You could one word from you and they'd stopped. You could fix this. You fix everything. Just this once. For me, Walter Brennan stood with his box of nothing decades behind him and 40 acres and his wife's whole quiet love now in his hands. And he looked at his son for a long moment. "You're right," he said. "I fixed things. I fixed this farm. I fixed Coletta's machine. I fixed a boy who didn't have a father. Last week, taught him how to wire a panel, and he looked at me like I'd hung the moon." His voice did not rise. "I'd have fixed anything for you, Derek. There was nothing I wouldn't have done. All you ever had to do was ask me. You didn't ask. You forged my name, and you changed the locks, and you tried to have a court say I'd lost my mind." He put on his reading glasses, the way a man does when he's finished looking at something. "I'm not going to fix this one. This one you built yourself. You're going to stand in it." He picked up his hat. "Your mother left a note." It said for Walter when he's done taking care of everyone else. "I've decided I'm not done. There's a town full of kids who never had what you threw away. That's where it's going. Every dollar." And he walked down the courthouse steps into the cold, and he did not look back, and the door behind him stayed open the whole way down. Spring came back to Cedar Hollow the way it always did, slow and then all at once, and on a Tuesday morning in May, the doors of the old Grange Hall opened at 4:40, not because anyone needed them open that early, but because that was the hour Walter Brennan still woke, and a man might as well put the percolator on the hall had a new name now. Cut into a brass plaque beside the door, the Eleanor Brennan table no child eats alone. Inside the kitchen Walter had wired with his own hands ran warm, and 12 kids filed in out of the gray morning kids who had aged out, kids who were close to it, kids from families that had simply run short that month. They sat at long tables and ate, and the noise of them filled a building that had stood empty for 10 years. Walter worked the room with a coffee pot. He knew their names. He knew which one wanted to learn engines, and which one was scared of the welding torch, and which one, a tall, quiet boy named Tyrell, had spent a December night in a truck behind the grain elevator and now lived in the upstairs of the farmhouse and was learning. Slowly, that some doors stay open, the farmhouse was full again. 6 beds where Derek's bare room had been. The porch swing with the dent in it still hung off the back, and most evenings somebody was in it. Walter kept the bedroom that had been his and Eleanor's. On the wall, framed, hung the original deed to the farm, and beside it, the 1986 signature card. And beside that, a photograph of a woman everyone in town had once assumed left her husband with nothing. Derek's name came up in the county paper twice that spring: a guilty plea, a sentence. Walter read both, set the paper down, and went back to work. The 1-bedroom apartment Derek would return to, when he returned, was on the east side of town, and the road from it to the lumber yard where he'd taken a job ran straight past the Grange Hall. He drove past the brass plaque every morning. Walter knew it. He had not arranged it, and he did not undo it. On that Tuesday in May, Walter stood in the doorway of the Eleanor Brennan table with the coffee pot in his hand and the early light coming up gold over Cedar Hollow, the way it used to come up over 40 acres while he stood at a kitchen window and told his wife the weather. He set out 2 mugs on the counter. He filled both. He did not put one back.